I had a fun idea for a little project while I think about what I'd like to tackle next now that I'm finally free of the never-ending nightmare that is High Guardian Spice. And I thought, what if I make a video ranking every single Disney movie? You see, I have all this random trivia about Disney's animated movies in my head, especially the earlier films, so why not go through them and make a little ranking for the internet because people enjoy ranking videos? What could possibly go wrong? There might have been a slight miscalculation on my part. Nonetheless, I still want to do this because I don't think I'd really sit down and tackle one of these films in a singular deep dive video. So many videos have been done on Disney films, both on YouTube as well as professionally, across the entire company's existence with all kinds of interviews and such. I don't know how much I could contribute, quite frankly. Hey, do you ever think about the fact that in 4 years' time Mickey Mouse is turning 100? Anyway, I cut the entirety of Disney's catalog into chunks that only sort of roughly make sense to nobody else but me. So here we go on a new endless journey of me info dumping random animation facts on you for an as yet unknown amount of time.
Here we go!
I have reached the point where it's impossible for me to watch Snow White in a vacuum. Because when I try and watch this movie, all that's going on in my head is...
In 1923, with a young
Disney
cartoonist named
Walt
Walt
an
Disney
Academy
getting on a
Award
train
and
from
secured
In February of 1938,
And although that's still true, I actually enjoyed this rewatch more than I was expecting to. I had a memory of not being very fond of this movie because I really didn't like the way it was animated. The animation that I remember bothering me was the dwarfs being especially weightless and rubbery. However, watching it again in who knows how long, this didn't bother me as much this time. I don't know if it's because Rubber Hose has made a bit of a comeback in recent years, or if I had just grown to appreciate it, but it only really bothered me this time by how starkly it contrasted with the rotoscoped characters. Whenever people make fun of how saccharine Disney movies are, they almost always parody imagery from this movie. Having little animal friends, singing while doing mundane tasks, dancing and everyone getting along and everything being positive. But what I forgot is how the actual Snow White movie isn't really as sappy as I think people remember it as. It has a very good balance of cynicism by adding the character of Grumpy. I was taught in college that Grumpy was actually added specifically as an audience proxy for the critics who at the time did not believe you could make an 83-minute cartoon. Annoyed by this new development, shaking up the status quo, kind of warming up to Snow White but not wanting to admit it, and then by the end completely devastated by her death more than anyone else. And then he's the only character who gets this small little extra detail here, which I really like a lot. It stops the movie from turning into, well...
Where the rainbow ends and everything is gay and the Easter bunny.
I also think I didn't really appreciate the backgrounds before. They have that almost chalky look to them you saw a lot in the 30s, but it's like the typical 1930s background with a layer of extra detail to it. It's like the Silly Symphonies, but an upgraded version. I also never appreciated how Germanic the design of this movie is. I think the way Disney Corporation has polished the way Snow White looks in their various marketing images and posters has made me forget that the original has much more in common with Arthur Rackham than it does with modern Disney art. I feel a lot of this movie was extremely nostalgic by design. Not for me, but for people who were adults in 1937. Both in its visuals calling back to the golden age of children's books illustrations, to the overly warbly falsetto voice of Snow White, which I can promise you was already old-fashioned when this movie aired, if you compare to how dialogue sounded in other films released around the same time.
We'll have the other papers crazy. Babe, I could kiss you.
Oh, no. Our deal was for a month's vacation.
Sure.
With pay.
You'll get it, babe. You'll get it.
I think a lot of people hand-wave away a lot of its elements as being outdated, but very of its time, when in reality I think it was purposefully old-fashioned the second it came out. What I did find, however, is that despite not being very long, this movie really drags. Some sequences go on for almost 7 minutes with very little actually happening in them. This might be a modern problem though, because one of the main criticisms Disney got when he said he was going to make a feature-length animated movie was that nobody would sit through a Mickey Mouse style short for a full 83 minutes because it would be exhausting. exhausting. I don't think this was really overcompensation when the movie came out, but I think the fact that it is so slow paced was partly because that's what it needed to have it acclimate people to watching something animated for that long amount of time for the first time. I think it worked better when the movie was released, both for animators who had never really worked on an 83-minute structured narrative, as well as an audience who had never sat and watched animation for a period of time longer than 7 or 8 minutes. There were actual newspaper articles saying that it was damaging to your eyes and brain to watch animated images for too long a period of time. Also, I know this section is going on a little and we just started, but can I just say how nice it is to watch a Disney movie and just have it be a story? No meta-awareness of tropes that need to be subverted, no hip with the kids references, no 13th first gay character for people to write articles about. It's just a movie, which someone made because they thought it would be good and people would enjoy it. And it's just nice. It's just nice and I guess in a way honest. It's very rough around the edges, but it's also polished enough to make you forget nobody had done animation like this before. Which I think we take for granted these days, how insane this movie must have been when it was released, and why 1930s newsreels called it a miracle of film.
This is a cartoon from 1935, and this is Snow White just 2 years later.
Snow White is the first entry on the list. We'll see how it ranks up as we go along. So here's the thing. I think I just don't like Pinocchio.
Father, when can I leave to be on my own? I've got the whole world to see.
I grew up watching the German Pinocchio cartoon and I didn't really like that. I had an illustrated, abridged and slightly less horrific version in the monthly Book on Tape magazine as a child, and I didn't really like that, although this illustration of Pinocchio making a snake laugh so hard it explodes is forever etched into my brain. I watched the live action movie once and I didn't really like that. And the Disney movie is one I actually remember seeing a lot as a kid, unlike Snow White, which I think I may have seen once. And I don't really like the Disney version either, which isn't really Disney's fault. Jiminy Cricket might as well be an original character to the movie, because the first thing Pinocchio does in the book is squash him. I really like his voice provided by Cliff Edwards. It has the same lilt to it that Jimmy Stewart's had, which I'm sure a language historian could give me more input as to why. But I'm not the biggest fan of how Jiminy continuously addresses the audience throughout the film. I don't usually mind a narrator in a movie, even if the narrator is also a character on screen, but here it feels like Jiminy's running commentary distracts more than it helps the story happening. Although this becomes less of a thing in the later part of the movie. The wink wink nudge nudge in on the joke style of writing is just one of my least favorite ways to do a Disney movie. It's on the same level as Maui referencing Twitter. This one has better pacing than Snow White, making it less of a drag to watch, despite it being roughly the same length. Maybe because the movie has a lot more locations and scenarios play out on screen, whereas a lot of time in Snow White, it's spent only in the dwarves' cottage. The animation is also vastly improved in Pinocchio. Pinocchio? It's Pinocchio in English, it's Pinocchio in Afrikaans. I'm gonna keep switching, just deal with it. Everything feels a lot more solid and with a believable weight to it. But overall, there's just an underlying unpleasantness to this story I just don't like. And this is after Walt himself realized this and tried to tell the story with a more lighthearted tone than the book. And no, I don't dislike it because of the donkey scene. I actually like the donkey scene, but a lot of this movie is just unpleasant. I don't like a lot of the sound design in Geppetto's workshop with all its harsh bells and whistles. I find the clocks off-putting. I don't like the warble effect on the voices underwater, which I find very tinny and grating to listen to. I don't like that a lot of the physical comedy at the start of it is all based on annoyance. Either seeing Jiminy get annoyed with the clocks or Figaro getting annoyed at being kept awake. It's just a lot of comedy based on being annoyed, which is annoying. I don't have any feelings for Pinocchio as a character. He's portrayed as a blank slate who is easily manipulated into things, which is the point, but it makes it hard for me to really care about him. And having our only other character we identify with be Jiminy, who is constantly talking directly to the audience, while also being terrible at his literal one job. It just comes together in an atmosphere I don't enjoy. However, I know for a fact that all the reasons I just listed are things people love about this movie or things people will outright disagree with me on, and they wouldn't even be wrong. I found myself having more fun with the Monstro scenes right at the end. I like the dry brush paint used in all of the water effects, and the overall way Monstro is drawn and shaded. But this is such a small part of the movie, and the rest just doesn't do it for me. I also feel that although the character animation shows a large amount of improvement and the backgrounds are lush and detailed, the camera work is a lot less ambitious, except for one scene panning over the town, which is really good. A lot of the movie, however, feels like one of the Mickey Mouse cartoons that were released around the same time period. The one thing I can give no criticism to, however, is the score. I'm not super into the songs themselves, apart from Wish Upon a Star, which is genuinely one of the nicest pieces of music Disney has ever made. But the background score that echoes the individual songs, I found myself liking a lot more than the songs themselves. But despite not feeling as dragged out as Snow White, I'm afraid I'm still gonna have to put it below it, just because I was genuinely charmed with rewatching Snow White and ended up liking it more than I remember doing so. But Pinocchio was a film I remember not liking, even as a kid, and the years gap between then and seeing it now hasn't improved it for me. I don't know, maybe the Del Toro one will finally be the Pinocchio story I actually enjoy. How is Fantasia only the third animated Disney movie? This feels like a risky experimental piece he would have put out after at least 4 or 5 of these films? But as only the third? That is a ballsy move. Although if all of this had happened in the modern day, Fantasia would have been called Silly Symphonies the Movie. It's not exactly what it is, but it's clear where Fantasia's roots come from. I actually thought the reason Fantasia didn't make that much money upon its release was because it's this weird experimental movie that's over 2 hours long. But just checking Wikipedia, it seems the real reason it didn't make its money originally was due to it not having a European release due to, the troubles. It's made its money back and then some with time, however. Anyway, onto the movie itself. I spent an embarrassingly long amount of time for the first half being grumpy at the people I've seen complain about this movie. I will appear in your house at 3 AM, Angela Edigo. The most common criticism of Fantasia I've seen is that most of the sequences are just animation for its own sake. Well, yes. What a strange thing to criticize. Do you also go to concert and complain that the guitar solo is just music for its own sake too? I did try to stop being salty and actually focus on the movie eventually. When I was a kid, the Nutcracker Suite was always my favorite, but this time I found myself really enjoying the Rite of Spring sequence. Partly because it was me going, yes, show me the inaccurate dinosaurs! And partly because I really enjoy the early Earth footage. It also made me realize that Fantasia feels more cinematic than Pinocchio did. There's just a lot more going on in the actual cinematography compared to Pinocchio, which despite its lush backgrounds, felt pretty flat to me. Also, with it only being the third movie, it was so nice to see some Disney girls drawn in an actual art style with Fred Moore's Centaurettes. Both Snow White and the Blue Fairy were rotoscoped, so I was surprised by how refreshing it felt to see some animated girls who were true cartoons. Also, these centaurs must have been a bitch to animate. Humans are one of the hardest things to animate properly because it's extremely obvious when you get humans wrong. But the other hardest things to animate or even just draw are horses. So having both in one design and then have multiple running around could not have been easy. Also, rewatching the Night on Bald Mountain scene made me realize how much inspiration it must have taken from the movie Hexen, which is one of my favorite silent films, as well as Faust, which I haven't sat down and watched yet, but I recognize the visuals just because they're so striking, and I think that's pretty cool. I could say a lot more about Fantasia and what I like about it, but we have a lot of movies to get through. I liked it a lot despite the long runtime. It feels less of a drag to get through than Snow White despite being much longer. Fantasia is at the top of the list.
But that was a
artistic success, financial failure.
Certainly an artistic success. It was a magnificent.
Well, there's some people would question that too.
Well, after 2 hours, that was Fantasia, it's nice to watch a movie literally half as long. I always remember Dumbo as being similar to Pinocchio in that it has a very unpleasant undertone to it, but rewatching it, I think I get it now. Dumbo does have a nastiness to it, but unlike Pinocchio, the nasty undertone in Dumbo is completely deliberate. Rather than being a whimsical and magical portrayal of the circus as the greatest show on earth, it mainly shows the circus from behind the scenes viewpoint. We don't see the circus through the lens of a child being amazed by the acts and the atmosphere. We see the circus from the viewpoint of the workers and underpaid performance. They actually say they're underpaid in one of the lyrics of the songs. Rather than being a place of wonder, we see it as a place just as seedy and unsavory as city docks or a steel mill. Filled with hard-drinking laborers, cliques of gossipy bitches, and an internal hierarchy. This also goes beyond the circus in the brief scene we have with the crows who stumble across Dumbo and Timothy the Mouse. With the crows coming across as traveling workers passing by on a road during this time period, which gave the film a weird kind of realism in a strange way. I'm not sure how to explain it. Speaking of the crows, this movie gets an enormous amount of flack for them. I am not going to really deny this criticism because Disney had a terrible track record up to this point. However, I am going to ask if I have any Black Americans watching this, if you could give me a little context as to why this movie gets singled out a lot. Now, I get the very obvious problem of making the black-coded characters in this movie literal crows, and one of them being named in the model sheet as literally Jim Crow, because they thought that was funny for some reason. And the fact that he is voiced by Cliff Richards, doing an impression of a stereotypical Southern black accent, which is not great, even if it was just to find a role in the film for Cliff Richards so he could have enough money to eat for a while. All the other crows are voiced by the black artists from the Hal Johnson Choir, and Hal Johnson was originally from Georgia. The Crows' dance movements were referencing a local dance duo called the Jackson Brothers as well, who were brought into the studio for the animators to study. Like, I'm fully aware why the voice work and the name is super shitty, but as a non-American, I don't know if these characters were not literal crows, if this would still be seen as one of the Disney's most racist moments, as people call it. They'd call it a racist moment, sure, but to be labeled as one of the worst moments in the racism of Disney, it seems a little tame in comparison, unless I'm missing something. I'm not playing the devil's advocate, I'm genuinely asking because this is not my culture. For the video I did on 1930s surrealism cartoons, which I highly recommend you watch, even though it's only partly monetized because it's a very good video, I watched Ken Burns' documentary on the history of jazz. Mostly I just watched the first 2 episodes, which covered the early 1900s up until the 1930s for that video. And the style of speech and the song When I See an Elephant Fly all sound authentic to the early style of jazz heard in the American South and the real people who came from this part of the country. Also, we see from the map at the start of this movie, it does actually take place around Florida and its surrounding states. So the style of music is not inauthentic, nor is the way these characters speak. I do understand it's a caricature, but as an uneducated person in this matter, I don't see it as being hateful. I read that a lot of the Crows' dialogue is based on the banter that can be heard from records of Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong, as well as other jazz albums of the time.
Your gal, she loves you, she thinks you're nice. She claims you got everything to take you to paradise, ain't that our killer?
Perhaps it was a bit of an outdated depiction in 1941 when this style of black culture seems more rooted in the 1920s and 30s. So maybe due to it being out of date contributes to why it's seen as a racist caricature coupled with Disney's bad track record and the bad decision to make them literal crows, as well as trying to find a job for Cliff Richards. I'm just confused because having watched the jazz documentary, there did exist an entire black culture which these characters are pulled from. And incidentally, apart from the lead crow, are voiced by people who literally came from these neighborhoods. And I'm struggling to understand how the history of black culture and the people who really lived and existed is supposed to be racist in of itself to the degree that people say this movie is. Black people and black culture existing is not racist because being black is not shameful. If you guys can give me some insight in the comments as to why these characters are given as much hate as they are, I'd appreciate it because I'm just a little unclear on the nuance here and I'd like to learn, especially as somebody who's not from the US. I will, however, question the claim that the song of the Roustabouts is racist. People say it's because the song is laborers singing about never having to learn to read or write and the fact that they are laborers as a result, but I'm not sure if they were specifically intended to be black, unless that is clearly stated somewhere and I missed it. I'm busy working through my Disney history books, but it's 900 pages long, so forgive me for being behind on this topic. They're drawn in dark shadow with no specific features of any kind, but isn't it just a design choice because the scene takes place at night during a storm? And we're supposed to see them and the circus as a whole as being rather unsavory to contrast to the fun carnival atmosphere it tries to sell to the townspeople, which is kind of the entire tone of the movie. Maybe I'm wrong and there's something I'm missing that specifically racially codes the laborers, or the animators talked about it in later years, but I'm not sure if it's just hyper-focused on due to the crows also existing in the same movie. However, if these guys are supposed to be black-coded, then yeah, no, the song is very racist. Moving on, I do think this is the first of the Disney movies I've watched where I find the music to all be genuine bops. Casey Jr. is probably one of my low-key favorite songs from the early Disney movies.
Casey Jr.'s coming down the track with a smoky stack.
The song of the Roustabout is really good too. When I See an Elephant Fly is generally one of the best songs of the classic Disney era. It's so good. Baby Mine is probably one of the saddest Disney songs ever. I don't think there's one song in this movie that I feel like I have to endure through like I did with Snow White and Pinocchio, except for maybe Look Out for Mr. Stork, but that's over and done with so quickly. Also, I think I like Timothy more than I like Jiminy Cricket. Jiminy's fourth wall breaking wasn't really my kind of thing, and him being Pinocchio's conscience but then also coming across as rather unsavory in many places felt really weird to me. But Timothy feels like one of the backstage hands at a turn-of-the-century circus. I also like that whereas Jiminy was moralizing to Pinocchio in an attempt to keep him on the right path, Timothy comes across as genuinely empathizing with Dumbo, trying to get the kid on his feet. And when people hurt Dumbo's feelings, he acts as emotionally hurt as if they were insulting him too. There's a sense of solidarity between Timothy and Dumbo, which I don't get from Jiminy. Not to mention, Jiminy sometimes feels like he's only helping Pinocchio because of the potential ire of the Blue Fairy and the promise of a shiny metal if he does a good job. Also, Jiminy is terrible at his job. Timothy has literally no reason to side himself with Dumbo. He just sees a kid getting picked on and goes, "That's not fair," and puts himself on Dumbo's side. He's not supposed to be a beacon of morality, he's just some guy. I don't know, I found Dumbo to be a lot more enjoyable than I remember. I'm gonna put it above Pinocchio but under Snow White, just because Snow White has a certain charm and unexplained mystique to it as the very first film. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this movie. See, on the one hand, this is one of the most gorgeous movies I've ever seen in my life. And the character animation on the animals is, without trying to make a joke of it, better than most of the animal animation I have seen from Disney in the past 10 years. Where modern Disney seems devoted to the idea that every single animal moves and behaves the same way as a dog. Seeing how much Bambi leaves modern animal animation in the fucking dust is pretty shameful, honestly. Also, the backgrounds of this movie is nothing short of insane. One reason I was excited to see this again with more knowledge I have now is to see the background art from Tyrus Wong, whose influence was a game changer. Compare the way the forest looks in Snow White to the way the forest looks in Bambi. I really like the background art direction of Snow White, but the forest in Bambi is so thick with atmosphere and dripping with presence, I am pained to say they're just objectively better. This movie is also where Fantasia's lessons can be seen in how the colors are a lot more experimental compared to earlier films. And of course there is the dog scene, which is famous for being one of the first major Disney scenes done by a female animator, Retta Scott, at the studio, which is famous for being a boys club and, well, kind of still is to a certain degree. I also really like the concept of this film, which I think is remarkably well done, which is that the entire movie is not about a specific noteworthy event, but is rather a sort of vertical slice of life in a forest. This movie could take place in any specific time really, and if you're American, it can also largely take place in any forested woodland on the eastern side of the country. This movie also does what The Lion King took inspiration from, starting in its opening sequence with "Love is a Song That Never Ends," and closing the movie with its final shot and end card with the same song. It's really a masterpiece of a movie, and it was absolutely, positively not made for me. This movie, unfortunately, has two of my biggest kryptonites in it. Firstly, and what might be a shock for some of you, insipid, pointless, cutesy nonsense. Look, I like cute, my art portrays that, but I like my cute to have some kind of teeth to it. It's why I like Sailor Moon, but I couldn't get into Tokyo Mew Mew. It's why the VTubers I watch are Nyanners, Iron Mouse, and Klemps, compared to other, more wholesome VTubers, I guess.
Oh my god, are those feet? Woo!
A good 40 minutes of this movie is what my friend described as a lot of fluffy animal capering bullshit. I do appreciate having Thumper actually sound and behave like a real child rather than some horrible chimera made out of sugar designed to look like a child, but a lot of the interaction between the children characters do have that distinct, deliberately manufactured to be adorableness to them, which I really hate. So to have over 40 minutes devoted almost exclusively to big-eyed animals doing cute things is a little painful for me to sit through. And secondly, this movie has what I refer to as hetero bullshit. Now, before you get defensive in the comments, hetero bullshit doesn't mean has a straight romance in it. If that were the case, there'd be almost no Disney movies I like. Now, hetero bullshit is very different to a boy and a girl falling in love. Hetero bullshit is having a really small little boy meet a really small little girl, and their very first interaction is him being unsure what to make of her, while she, as the more emotionally mature one, is a little bit more aware that they are of the opposite gender, and therefore must interact in a romantically charged way. So you have her dancing around him and giggling because he's a boy, and sneaking in cutesy child kissing while the dumb old boy, who is still too young to be into girls, is just kind of annoyed and confused by her. Hetero bullshit is having an extended sequence of our characters learning what romance is, going, "Ew, that sounds lame," and the entire scene is set up so the audience watching the movie can chortle at how foolish and silly the characters are for thinking they can escape the inevitable slow approach of a relationship. Hetero bullshit is putting a female non-character next to one of the main boy characters and having them completely derail their life, because putting a boy and a girl within a 10-foot radius of each other is like turning on an electromagnet to the point of not even bothering to give the newly introduced girl any lines of dialogue, because her having a personality is irrelevant. She is the object of romance purely by her existence. And all of this is treated as scientifically predictable, that denying this is what will happen is like saying, "Oh, you don't think gravity is going to affect you tomorrow." That is hetero bullshit. And before you think I might be overreacting due to how I feel about this sort of thing in my media, this movie is 80 minutes long, and an entire 12 minutes of that runtime is literally just the Twitter-pated scene. This for 12 minutes! There's a lot of this movie I like, but sitting down and watching it in its entirety is not something I really enjoyed doing. I almost wish this movie existed in a different way so I could enjoy it. And no, the straight-to-video sequel is not what I mean. That movie misses the point to the first one so hard, it's like trying to make Cruella de Vil sympathetic. I'm putting Bambi below Snow White but above Dumbo. I enjoy Dumbo more as an experience, but Bambi's art is so good and its concept so strong, it manages to pull itself just above it. Also, I can't believe it took them until Bambi to realize putting an highlight on the character makes them more appealing.
Saludos Amigos, a fond greeting to you.
actually going to skip most of the package movies because I know most people wouldn't really consider them part of this list anyway. And there's like 5 of them all in a row, and I can see myself getting burnt out if I did all of them. However, I didn't want to skip the first one, Saludos Amigos, for 2 reasons. The first is that it was the first movie in which Mary Blair's art was a major influence, and her art cannot be overstated in how important it is to the Disney movies moving forward. And second, because this movie ends with Aquarela do Brasil, which introduces one of my favorite Disney canon characters. Saludos Amigos is a weird one. Okay, how do I explain this? So, in 1941, just before the US entered World War II, the American government had a large concern about Germany getting a foothold in South America, as many of the political leaders at the time had close ties with the Nazi Party. No official alliances had been drawn up, but the concern was about a possible Nazi threat being so close to the US border. In an effort to counteract this friendliness, the US launched the Good Neighbor policy in an effort to strengthen the ties between the US and Latin America. Disney cartoons were very popular in South America, so the American state government commissioned Disney and several of his crew from different departments at the studio on a goodwill tour. Disney was hard on money as he had just expanded his studio right before the European market closed to his films due to the war. And there was the matter of the Disney's Animator strike of 1941. So the US government gave Disney a federal loan guaranteed to make the film Saludos Amigos, which is part travel footage and part cartoon segments. So the money was good, and Walt essentially running away from his problems and leading the lawyers to deal with it was good. The lawyers sided with the animators, by the way. Although granted, Walt was mostly against unionization because someone at some point convinced him unions were communism, and Walt was a very big patriot, so he saw the influx of communism into his studio as being anti-American. So that's why he was against the unionization and why the strike happened, and basically he ran away and let the lawyers deal with it. The cartoon sequences mostly focus on applauding and paying respect to the various South American countries, often by placing the bumbling American tourists of Donald and Goofy in the new foreign environments, while the live-action sequences show the American public the modern, stylish cities of South America, which was apparently really shocking to a lot of the American public who, surprise, surprise, were under the impression only America and Europe looked like this.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
The movie is only a little over 40 minutes long, but it does a very good job. Because it was made as an ambassador film, it is very careful to never portray any of the South American countries, people, or culture in a way that seems... how should I put it? Okay, so picture in your head how you'd imagine an American travel documentary in the 1940s would explain an exotic foreign country with exotic foreign cultures that are very not American and very not white to an American audience. This film does not, in fact, do that, but also somehow manages not to come across as pandering or like obsequious, I guess is the word. There is still an air of separation between the film and the people it showcases, unlike, say, Coco, which despite also being a South American focused film made by primarily United States filmmakers, feels more like you are directly tied to the characters within the film. Whereas this one, there is a degree of separation, giving it the feeling of observing the cultures as an outsider. But I do feel it was made with an earnest attempt at giving respect, instead of putting these cultures on display for an American audience like a zoo exhibit. It's not perfect, but it's the early 40s and it's trying. There's a really sweet honesty to this film. Donald is shown as being terrified of the heights of Peru, while the Peruvian people are shown as sure-footed and amused by his fear, but not unkind or cruel. Goofy is given a typical style of Goofy Explains short, I forget what they're actually called, where the ways of the Argentinian gaucho is explained and the humor comes from Goofy just kind of being an idiot. But the segment very clearly shows this is Goofy from Texas put into Argentina and not meant to represent the Argentinians themselves. And then you have the Aquarela do Brasil segments at the end, which is one of my absolute favorite Disney short things they've ever done. 11 years before Duckamuck pushed this idea to an extreme, we get to see a paintbrush literally draw and create Jose, who I kept pronouncing Jose, and he himself pronounces it Jose, so I'm gonna try and say it properly from now on, but I'll probably say Jose by mistake here and there. And we get to see the watercolors paint themselves into existence as Jose shows Donald around Rio, the city he loves so much. I love this segment and I love Jose so much. Is it Jose? Hold on.
Jose.
Okay, so it is Jose. I love this segment and I love Jose so much because of how he's characterized. I can't show the entire sequence because Disney, but look at how Jose reacts to finding out the person he's talking to is the Donald Duck from the Disney studio.
O Pato Donald! O Pato Donald! Ora, venha de lá abraço, mesmo daqueles, quebra-costelas.
This is not a character. This is 100% one or maybe a few people the animators met on this trip, and you cannot convince me otherwise. This movie is also great for nerds like me because you get to see several of the crew in front of the camera. You also get to see Mary Blair showing off some of her studies she was painting on the trip, which is great. I'm gonna have to rewatch it after I watch Walt and El Grupo, as well as South of the Border with Disney, which I won't do for this video, but I'll do just for my own entertainment. In case you couldn't tell, I quite liked this one, but I don't think I can put it on the same level as some of the other films. I like it a lot because of its historic and cultural significance, but not really as a movie that you watch. I'm putting it below Bambi, but above Dumbo. And now for one of Disney's most famous and beloved films. I'm not gonna lie, part of why I wanted to do this list was so I could include Victory Through Air Power because I thought it would be funny. I watched like 60 movies just so I could make this joke.
Who's laughing now?
Guys, you have no idea how much I am cursing the YouTube copyright system at this specific moment, because nothing in my entire life would give me more joy than to show some of the footage in this film with Sabaton playing over it. And that limitation is making me die inside. I just want you all to be aware of my suffering before we move on. That being said, I promise I'm not going to launch into a full history lecture with this film. I had to sit through 5 minutes of Leonard Moulton explaining the movie to me before the movie starts, so I'm not going to do the same to you. Very long story short, ex-Russian, now American Major Seversky, and this is him in the film, wrote a book called Victory Through Air Power, which insisted America needed to change their approach to World War II by focusing on long-range bombing with aircraft. Disney read the book and felt so strongly about it, he made it into an animated film to further push this idea. RKO didn't want to release it, so he did it through United Artists. Winston Churchill saw the movie, and when he heard Roosevelt hadn't seen it, he pestered the US president until he got his hands on a reel and watched it. Shortly after, America refocused their efforts on long-range bombing using aircraft. This movie low-key majorly contributed to victory in the war. This isn't the only time Disney did this, by the way. It won't come up in any of the other films, so I'll just mention it here. But after he was given asylum in America, Werner von Braun was assimilated into NASA to help with the space program. Von Braun is a weird one. He basically helped the Nazis build bombs and missiles for no reason other than it would help him develop a way to get to the moon. And the second the Nazis were defeated, he sold them out because America put him on the NASA team. The guy didn't give a shit about anything other than getting to the moon. Anyway, so he had all this information and research on how to get to the moon by the 50s, but he didn't have the money, which is why the Russians kept beating the US in the space race, because their space program was actually funded properly and all America cared about was making Braun build bigger and better missiles. So Braun, who was sick of making bombs and not going to the moon, brought this rocketeering info to Disney, who liked it so much that he made some educational shorts about it in order to sell the public on the idea of funding the space program, which swayed the American government to give NASA the funds, especially after the whole Sputnik thing. So yeah, If I had a nickel for every time Disney helped an expat convince a stubborn American government into a change of focus regarding aeronautics by use of an animated educational film, I'd have 2 nickels.
Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
Anyway, onto the movie itself. The biggest impression of this film is that it's Disney and Major Seversky desperately and frantically grabbing President Roosevelt by his collar and shaking him violently, going, "Would you please listen, for God's sakes, we've been telling you to make an Air Force since 1919.
The military men of the old school were unwilling to recognize this fundamental change in war making. They stubbornly continued to pour the resources of their nations into weapons that had already outlived their usefulness."
And honestly, I feel that. Screaming at your government in frustration to please just fucking listen seems to be a global pandemic lately. Apart from that, based on everything I just told you, this movie is pretty much exactly what you're picturing in your head. It's a little over an hour-long debate in video form arguing the validity of what the film creators believe in using facts and logic. There's some neat visual metaphors here and there. I really like the visual of America as the beating heart of industry and its supply lines to the front as arteries. And I like the visual of the rising sun stretching rays being the visual indication of the range of Japan's fighter planes. But this movie, I'd only say is worth watching if you're really into warplanes, you're really into the history of warfare, which I am not, just for the record, it's not really my area of interests, or if you're really into the timeline of technological advancement. There's some really good singular sentences and factoids in this, which I assume are directly from the book. I wish I could just show you a string of these, but I'm probably the only person here who finds them interesting. One that really hit me was Seversky saying the airplane is the only instrument of war at the time to see its biggest development happen in peacetime. Little things like that which are cool to think about, but are very well written, but mostly stay in the area of, oh, that's interesting. If you're into animation, you might put it on while you're playing Stardew or something and just look over when there's an interesting visual. But I really like history and I was waiting for it to finish at about 40 minutes in. Also, it's kind of anxiety inducing in a way. This movie was made in 1943 after Pearl Harbor, so things were pretty grim and victory wasn't a sure thing. So there's a great emphasis on urgency and a plea to action. It's just a little upsetting, especially near the end when they start talking about bombing Japan, so there's that as well. I had to keep reminding myself that this war is over and it can't hurt me anymore. Well, not directly anyway. Oh jeez, how do I even rank this one? The joke of including this one was totally not worth it, by the way. I'm gonna put it marginally above Dumbo, despite Dumbo being a far better movie, just because it's historically important and I'm glad it exists for me to look at and go, huh, that's interesting that that exists. But see, Puff, it's propaganda. I'm sorry, but is "we need to defeat the Nazis" a propaganda message you disagree with? Anyway, all that being said, I'm gonna stick with listening to Sabaton instead. Ideally, I would have watched this right after Saludos Amigos, but I'm doing these by date. Watching it now, it's kind of shocking to me that the Three Caballeros is as popular today as it is. And by popular, I don't mean Frozen being in cinemas for what felt like 3 years and every single piece of Disney merch for the entirety of the last decade only being Frozen merch, but popular in the sense that Disney nerds like the characters of the Three Caballeros a lot. Popular as in this movie came out in 1944 and still gets dedicated floats in Disneyland parades and sequences at Epcot. Popular as in both José and Panchito made appearances in The House of Mouse, the 2017 DuckTales cartoon, and the Three Caballeros had an entire ass show come out in 2018.
Three caballeros, three brave caballeros, they say we are birds of a feather.
I do wish the modern cartoons could get Brazilian actors to play José though, because even as a non-Brazilian I can hear the accent isn't right. But I'm biased and frankly nobody can replace José Oliveira. The character was literally made for him. Anyway, moving on, I'm getting sidetracked. The movie's continued popularity is absolutely shocking when you watch the movie itself. These package movies were done as a cost-saving measure during the lean years at Disney, both for money-saving reasons due to most Disney movies, apart from Snow White and Dumbo, not making any profit, but also because a very large chunk of the Disney animators were working on propaganda films for the American public, but also for the US military. There's an entire instructional short featuring the Seven Dwarfs about dealing with malaria, for instance.
Attaboy, Dopey, killer, good and dead.
So Three Caballeros is a budget movie as well as an anthology movie. However, it's not like Fantasia with very clear-cut sequences that follow upon each other. It starts that way, showing a short about a penguin traveling away from the South Pole to the Galapagos in a sequence I find very frustrating, and I'm not sure why it's even here because it has almost nothing to do with South America. Before the film cuts away and it shows several birds found in Brazil, but around the 20-minute mark, which felt like an eon to sit through, mind you, finally José shows up and the movie just abandons the structure of individual short packaged together. The movie then goes into mostly live action footage with animation laid over top of it. The multiplane camera is only used barely in the Ba'ai sequence, which doesn't really feature much animation itself, and merely shows off some incredible background art. And at several points in the film, it resorts to a literal slideshow of Mary Blair's art. The fact that this weird little movie is as popular as it is really surprising to me. But I'm by no means complaining. It's just really shocking that something as out of the box as this film has made as big of an impact as it has. Whereas most of the package movies that followed it have almost been forgotten apart from the Sleepy Hollow short and maybe the Mr. Toad short due to its Disneyland ride. But what sets Three Caballeros apart, I think, is Donald, José and Panchito bounce each other really well. And the movie is at its best the few times it's just the three of them. Honestly, despite this movie having no plot, it's a great lesson in character dynamics. Donald is cheerful and having a good time here, while still being unlucky and quick to get into ridiculous trouble. José, in contrast, is the super chill but very passionate one, who likes dancing, likes staying out all night partying and drinking but never gets drunk, and is always classy. And Panchito is the chaotic one who never lets anything bother him. And putting them together creates a fantastic dynamic where they all just get along very well. The other thing I think stuck with people about this movie is that the animation just goes off in the last 15 minutes or so. People often talk about the pink elephant scene in Dumbo, although I realize I didn't bother because we already know about it, but I think we forget how influential that sequence was. The Three Caballeros with no plot structure other than Mexico is awesome and Donald is only here for the girls gives the animators an opportunity to go extremely off the wall in many places in a way they just aren't able to in other Disney films. That being said, however, I think what I like about this film, The Three Caballeros and the surreal animation, is a little marred down by the rest of it. Like I said, it takes 20 minutes before José even shows up, and the 2 or 3 shorts before he does feel tedious when one of them has little to nothing to do with South America, one is just some cool bird designs, and one feels like it'd be more at home in one of the other packaged movies. Because the first 20 minutes was me getting impatient, just wanting José and Panchito to show up already, and I forgot how long that takes. Also, Donald getting wrapped up in how pretty the girls of South America are is a joke that wears pretty thin early on for me. It's not me crying about sexism, by the way. I just find it's a joke that outstays its welcome and I get bored. I prefer Saludos Amigos showing me a lot more of the various traditions, clothing and practices in various countries than Donald trying to flirt. I remember liking this movie a lot more than I did upon this rewatch. Maybe I was expecting a longer version of Saludos Amigos, but with more José as well as the addition of Panchito, and I'm just annoyed that that's not what I got. I think I'm also disappointed because I know I'm not going to see José or Panchito again in these movies, and I really like José's character especially. I love that unlike almost every other Disney birds, he was designed with his eyes on the side of his head like a real parrot rather than facing forward. The reason being, when they want to show José looking at something or someone, he has to cock his head to the side in what is an incredibly recognizable pose for a bird. Speaking of which, I will say the posing in this movie is fantastic. Look at Panchito's bullfighting poses here, my god. So yeah, sad I didn't like this one as much as I remembered. Maybe I need to watch the 2018 cartoon a little to get a bit of that fix I'm looking for with these characters. even if I don't think it'd be able to capture the 1940s Latin America style so specifically to that time period. Also, petition to give José his cigar back. I don't know why it bugs me so much they removed it, and I fully understand why, but this character looks incomplete without it. Alright, ranking. I'm putting this one above Dumbo but below Victory of Air Power, just because although it was easier to sit through than Air Power, I feel like I got more out of Air Power as a whole. Also, Air Power stuck with me for a while after watching it, whereas the Three Caballeros, I almost instantly forgot everything that I saw in it, and what I did remember, I realized all comes from Saludos Amigos. So, it's going under Victory through Air Power. Can you believe it took this long before we got the second princess movie? It makes sense when you think about it though. Snow White came out after the Great Depression, just as things started looking really ugly in Europe when the world could use a little happily ever after. And so a few years after the war, Cinderella comes out with a similar theme of hardship, sadness and abuse eventually coming to an end, and brighter days and happiness moving forward. Also, there's like a whole thing to do with how it helped Disney get back into making feature films after the lean years of the war and all that as well. Mary Blair is all over this movie as well. I thought her presence was powerful in Three Caballeros, but this movie is bleeding with her art. I keep mentioning Mary Blair and it probably sounds like I'm her biggest fan or something. Her art style is actually not really my favorite thing, but it's just I'm really excited to see Disney movies start leaning harder into interesting styles rather than pushing harder and harder into pure realism. Despite the fact that Cinderella was rotoscoped, much to the chagrin of the animators, if I remember correctly. Cinderella, I always hear, is the one Disney classic people come to and say, oh, this is a lot better than I was expecting. But I feel the first half of this movie is a bit of a drag unless you're really into the mice shenanigans. I don't mind the mice, I can handle them a lot better than the saccharine critters in Bambi, but for a movie about Cinderella, there are a lot of mice scenes in this film. We had an introductory sequence setting up the story. Couldn't we have more of this in the film and less mice shenanigans instead, maybe? Also, a possible hot take, but I don't like Cinderella's face at all. Sometimes she looks good and you can tell some animators were better at drawing her than others, but for the most part she just looks extremely uncanny, and her nose being nothing but nostrils reminds me of a grey, but I actually like greys and this just looks unappealing to me. Also, enjoy me pointing out to you that she has no ears. You're welcome. I struggled at first with Cinderella's character. I understand that her charm and ability to endure the abuse she has to live with every day is why we're supposed to like her, but I wish she was a little bit more expressive. Maybe if her face wasn't so plastic, we could have given her a little bit more character just in her facial expressions. But as it is, she just feels kind of generically nice. It does get better in the second half though. I love that she never even realized she had spent the entire evening with the prince, and she just went to this ball just to have one night of happiness, and after meeting this guy wasn't really interested in the fact that she never even got to meet the prince. And then when she finds out it was the prince, she drops the morning tea in shock. And when she hears the prince is looking to marry her, you have this shot which I adore. Before she stumbles off in a daze to get ready for the Duke, betraying what really happened last night and spurring Lady Tremaine into locking her up. But before this, she's just kind of generic. I want to like her, but her design matched with her calm personality doesn't do much for me. I still feel bad for her when bad things happen, but I don't feel connected to her. I wondered if this was due to Disney Studios being a boys' club at this time, as far as the writing and animation goes, but although that might be a factor as to why characters like Snow White and Cinderella and Aurora have no real personality, I don't think it's completely because of that, because other female characters in the classic Disney movies tend to be great. I love Lady Tremaine. She's one of the best things in this movie. Her design is fantastic. Her voice acting is amazing, but even beyond that, she has tiny little animated movements that are so good. There's this one scene where she's trying to get her daughters to fit the glass slipper and she gives that look. You know the one. That flash of an expression that older women like to do as a warning. It's so good. Joan Crawford looking ass. Actually, I wonder if she's based on Joan Crawford to a degree. I'll have to look if Crawford had any characters like this in the films before or around this time, because I want to guess Lady Tremaine was based on Joan Crawford as a person, but I don't know if Crawford's life was well known in the larger Hollywood industry as we know it to be now. Still, it's weird that Lady Tremaine, who is abusing her adopted daughter, looks a lot like Crawford did in her later years. Oh wait, apparently the Queen in Snow White was also based on Crawford? That either explains a lot about what Hollywood knew at the time, or it's just a very, very, very weird coincidence. Two Disney villainous women visually based on Crawford who abuse their daughters is... well, that sure is a coincidence.
That's suspicious. That's weird.
Moving on. On the opposite end of the spectrum, I love the animation on the fairy godmother. Also my first sighting of the milk Cole head bob. I see you, Cole. The fairy godmother is drawn so lovingly. She genuinely looks like an older lady and it makes me emotional to look at. I also believe the scene where Cinderella's dress changes was Walt's favorite piece of animation his studio ever did. But yeah, this one's okay. I feel we could have had less mice and more Cinderella, but it's fine. Maybe it's just less than the sum of its parts. It does have some legitimate funny moments here and there though.
Every eligible maiden is to attend.
Why, that's us, and I'm so eligible.
I'm putting it above Bambi, but below Snow White. Again, I think Snow White being the first and being such a trailblazer pushes it just a little above. I also think I liked Snow White more than Cinderella, although I like Lady Tremaine more than the Queen. I would tie them if I could, but that would be cheating.
You're crazy.
One last thing. A big joke people love to point out with this movie is, but why would Cinderella be the only girl who fits the slipper? What if a different girl fits the slipper? So much so that they made an entire straight-to-DVD sequel about this concept, which ended up being the best DVD sequel Disney ever did. Suck it, Lion King 2. But I never realized that they even mentioned this in the first movie itself. The king is hell-bent on having grandkids, to the point of threatening execution to the Duke if something gets in the way of this happening. So when the Duke, trying to save himself from being beheaded, mentions that although Cinderella got away, they have the slipper, the king is placated from murdering him.
But sire, this slipper may fit any number of girls.
That's his problem. He's given his word. We'll hold him to it.
Because this man doesn't give a fuck about actually finding Cinderella. He wants grandkids and he doesn't give a shit how he gets them or who gives them to him. Amazing. Cinderella 3 still has no right to be as good as it is though.
But the talking mice say she's the wrong girl. Son?
The heterosexual choir at the beginning of these is getting on my nerves with these later ones for some reason.
It's like kind of just funny. It's just like what a family-friendly arrangement sounds like, and I take a lot of delight in that.
This one is going to be a hard rewatch for me specifically because I already have a favorite animated version of Alice in Wonderland.
Tak pozdě. Halo, pane!
I don't know what it is, but something about this movie just does not work for me, and actually more than anything makes me irritated and annoyed afterwards. It's not the overload of nonsense, since not only is surrealist humor my favorite kind, but also because the nonsense in this movie is actually the part of it I like. I think part of it is, I don't really like Alice as a character. She doesn't work for me. I am glad to see the Disney animators finally figured out how to draw appealing female faces, since they for some reason didn't ever go back to Fred Moore's Centauret girls. Alice and her sister looks miles better in the face than Cinderella. And not only that, but Alice is very expressive and has some of my favorite subtle acting and facial expressions on the lead girl in one of these movies so far. But what I don't like about Alice in this movie, and have never liked about her even watching this movie as a child, is that when I was a kid I couldn't figure out if Alice is supposed to be a child or not. And as an adult I can recognize she is supposed to be a child, but she comes across as some weird homunculus bred to resemble a real child, but never able to really pull it off convincingly, giving a big uncanny valley effect.
Aliens? Us? Is this one of your Earth jokes?
I don't think giving a child fully drawn lips works. It automatically makes the child character look a lot older than she should be. The voice actress, Catherine Beaumont, was only 12 or 13 when she voiced Alice, but somehow sounds a lot older than that to me.
What are you studying so hard there, Catherine? Some of Alice's Jabberwocky?
No, worse than that. Algebras. You know, I think they were both invented by the same person.
Alice speaks in very formal English in the movie, which is accurate from her dialogue in the book. However, in the book, a lot of the humor comes from the fact that Alice never seems overly affected by how strange everything that happens to her is. And so having a very small child of around 7 respond to completely insane characters, which were mostly Victorian puns in such upper-class proper English, was part of the humor. Maybe Alice's dialogue in the movie would have worked better if her voice actress was a little younger to better contrast how proper her dialogue is. Or maybe I'm just overly aware of it because she's been drawn in the face, making her look neither like an adult nor a child. So as a result, the voice is throwing me off too. Also, why is she at the start of the film talking about how much she wishes she could live in a world of nonsense and whimsy when nothing about her behavior would suggest she'd be the kind of strange child who would prefer that kind of thing? She does go along with the nonsense more than I remember her doing, but I'm not sure why the Disney version felt the need to set up that Alice would want to live in such a world of nonsense. I don't know why, I'm just not a big fan of Alice. I also feel like all the characters are having a good time and being silly and doing stupid things, and then Alice wanders into the situation and just kind of kills the atmosphere. This is unique to the Disney version because I've never had any of these problems with other interpretation of the Alice books. The 1988 Alice movie, as I've said, is my favorite version of the story, and the 1985 Alice is very good too. And although I know the entire tone of the story is different, I feel the first American McGee's Alice also delivered her deadpan responses much better.
You've gone quite mangy, Cat, but your grin's a comfort.
Also, this is probably just me, but most of the first chunk of this movie for some reason kept making me think of the small dingy side-of-the-road theme parks you had in America in the 70s, made of fiberglass and asbestos. I'm pretty sure this movie created that aesthetic, but it doesn't change the fact that that's what I kept thinking of at first. The movie gets a lot more enjoyable right around the part where Alice gets lost in the woods and we see some really inventive animals, after which she runs into the Queen of Hearts, who completely steals the show. The second the Queen shows up, the whole movie becomes a lot more enjoyable. And since the movie pretty much ends after the Queen sequence, at least this movie ends on a high note. Also, the animation on the cards march is so insanely impressive. I know Alice's expressions were probably the hardest animation to do in the movie, but seeing the cards move in perspective like this is just so much fun to watch. I don't know why this one got on my nerves so much, since I don't even think it's that bad of a movie, but it just rubs me the wrong way.
Who are you?
I hardly know, sir. I've changed so many times since this morning, you see.
Say Alice.
Explain yourself.
I'm afraid I can't explain myself, sir, because I'm not myself, you know.
Say Alice.
Who are you?
Well, don't you think you ought to tell me who you are first?
Would you just say your name is Alice? You literally introduced yourself to the flowers less than 5 minutes ago. This one's going just above Pinocchio, because I disliked almost all of Pinocchio. At least Alice has some fun moments when the Queen shows up and I can enjoy the great acting in the animation. Not a fan of this one, I'll stick to the 1988 version. Peter Pan is a fascinating story. Even if you have not read the novelization of the play, the individual set pieces of the story and these characters are so clever that you can pick up on some of the broader symbolism just by having someone describe them. Wendy is a little girl on the verge of becoming a young lady, and as such, her father wants to move her out of the nursery she shares with her brothers and give her her own room, something she greatly objects to. Peter Pan shows up and whisks her off to Neverland along with her brothers, where children never grow up, but where the children of the island are in constant war with the only adults on the island, the leader of which, Captain Hook, is traditionally played on stage by the same actor who plays Wendy's father.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Hook himself is living in constant fear of a crocodile or alligator or whatnot who has swallowed a clock. So the leader of the only adults on the island, the king of adults, is constantly terrified of a ticking clock.
Hello? Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. Hook's afraid of an old dead clock. I think not. I think James Hook's afraid of time. Ticking away. Tick.
Wendy is a little girl who is about to be given her own room, a physical representation of her leaving childhood and transitioning into becoming a young lady, something she wants to stop from happening. But when Peter Pan is introduced, the very person who promises she will never have to make this transition into adolescence and can remain in permanent childhood, he also introduces the first flutterings of a crush from Wendy. Peter himself is shown as both forever carefree, forever young, forever without responsibility, things which on the surface look desirable and something all human beings would love. But Peter is also shown to be completely stunted, unable to comprehend deeper, more complex emotions and, as a result, unable to truly connect with real human beings.
Why do you spoil everything? We have fun, don't we? I taught you to fight and to fly. What more could there be?
There's so much more.
What? What else is there?
Meaning that Peter Pan lives forever, but Peter Pan also never truly lives.
To live would be an awfully big adventure.
And that's just the surface level of this story. That's not even going into the themes of Peter Pan's relationship with Wendy and Peter loving the concept of her as a mother because he cares for Wendy, but at the same time rejecting the figure of a mother due to his trauma surrounding his own mother rejecting him, and it's a lot. There's way too much. So it is truly incredible how the 1953 Disney adaptation of this story manages to include none of this. Disney sanctifying stories for animated films is nothing new by this point. From cleaning up Pinocchio's story to make the main character actually likable, to removing the underlying themes of persecution in Bambi, to simply not including the darker parts of classic fairy tales. But for this sanctification to happen to Peter Pan to the degree it does is almost unbelievable to me, because Walt Disney is, on paper, the perfect person to adapt this story. Peter Pan is about a damaged child who, due to the failures of the grown-ups in his life, vows to never grow up. It's about magic and wonderment and rejection and childhood loss. This movie is perfect for this studio. But instead, the Disney version removes the most vital pieces of the story, which ends up kneecapping the entire thing. Peter Pan himself doesn't have much of a character. He's detached from the other characters with a very short attention span, jumping from hyper-focusing on Wendy to completely forgetting about her when his attention snaps to something else. But there's no reason for it. He never shows any deeper character than this surface-level behavior. He also has some rather sexist ideas regarding girls when he first meets Wendy, which he merely mentions and is never brought up again or challenged, meaning this is just a building block of his personality. This on its own, completely removed from its source material, already makes for a rather flat character. But then you see the things that Peter Pan is lacking literally exist, and they chose to remove it. Peter Pan doesn't cry in the Disney movie, which causes Wendy to wake up, help him, and then Peter Pan to take credit for reattaching his shadow, and then asserting he wasn't crying about his shadow earlier, and also he never cries. He doesn't learn that Wendy's brother John thinks women are lesser to men and kicks John's ass for being a sexist. Nor does he ever mention there are no lost girls because girls are too clever to fall out of their prams. Peter doesn't take Wendy to become the mother to the lost boys because he is deeply yearning for a mother of his own, but equally angered by his own mother's rejection. He takes Wendy to be the lost boys' mother because he doesn't know what a mother is, and Wendy just tells him it's someone who tells stories. They don't even do the line, "To die would be an awfully big adventure."
Prepare to die, Peter.
To die would be a great adventure.
Death is the only adventure you have left.
And now, Peter Pan, you shall die.
To die will be an awfully big adventure.
Prepare to die!
Lie, Peter! Lie!
No! I gave my word.
The reason Wendy wants to go home in the Disney movie is because she was fully on board with this whole never growing up and staying in Neverland thing until she saw Peter being flirty with Tiger Lily. Then she gets jealous and decides she's going home, and then reminds John and Michael about their mother so they will come with her. This entire plot point happens just because Wendy is jealous of Tiger Lily because Peter shared a dance with her. She was fine with staying here, but after this scene, suddenly she's all, "Oh no, we must return to our real mother, John and Michael." Whatever, Wendy. And then you learn that the reason Wendy wants to go home in the book is because she is perfectly happy staying in Neverland because she has unwavering faith that her mother will always keep the window open for them. Until Peter points out his mother forgot about him, had a new baby, and closed and barred her windows. And learning that is even possible for a mother to reject and abandon her child, Wendy becomes frightened, and that is why she's suddenly so intent on her and her brothers returning home. It's almost like there's a theme here. But none of that is in the Disney version. The Disney version is nothing more but insipid faffing around for a while and having fun and then deciding to go home. And I mean, it is fun, there is enjoyment here, but it's so mindless. How did this movie end up so lacking in substance? The earlier Disney movies, despite being a lot more rough around the edges and having a good set of problems of their own, at least had the ability to include unpleasant topics. How did this end up so much fluff and nonsense? Even the sequel, made by Disney, managed to add deeper themes to it.
Wendy? Hello, Peter.
I don't understand.
Our first story deals with some pretty heavy shit. Racism.
Okay, let's briefly talk about the Indians in this movie. When the original play was written, it was 1905 in England. The concept of this very large group of people living way on the other side of the Atlantic in a foreign country, on the large stretching lands of the untamed West, who dressed and looked nothing like Europeans and yet interacted with them regularly, must have seemed to a British person as not only incredibly exotic, but both so far removed, both physically as well as mentally, it was borderline fantasy on the same level as mermaids and fairies and even pirates. But that story was written in England in 1905. This movie was made in America, in California, in the 50s. My limits for historical understanding and sympathy can only stretch so far. I understand that these are not the Native Americans that would go on to hold cultural exhibitions at Disneyland 2 years later. I understand that these characters are Indians, the fictional people that Walt and his peers grew up hearing about from old cowboy traveling shows like Buffalo Bill and don't reflect real Native American culture. I understand that this is the exact time cowboy and Indian TV shows were rampant as some weird concoction of nostalgia and racism. I understand all of that. But what I don't understand is why everybody talks about the crows in Dumbo as one of the most racist things in Disney movies that people still have easy access to, but the Indians in Peter Pan will only get a passing mention here and there as, oh yeah, that was also rather problematic. I don't even really know what I'm trying to say with this part. The Indians in Peter Pan are a lot worse than the crows in Dumbo, but get a fraction of the criticism. And they are not just a small part of this movie like the crows were, but are deeply woven into the narrative up until we're 56 minutes in when they finally leave the story. And it wouldn't bother me so much if people didn't cherry pick what they're outraged about. The movie's fine though. It's insipid and shallow, but I sat through it better than Alice in Wonderland. The character animation is extremely good to the point I kept marveling at how beautifully everyone moves. They got better with drawing young girls, helped greatly by just lightening Wendy's lips and Catherine's voice matching how old she looks a bit better. And Captain Hook is our very first Disney villain who leans into fun and camp, even if it's at the expense of intimidation and threat. Although the first thing he does in this movie is kill a man. Also, I like the background here more than Alice. It's a better balance of Mary Blair's design style and realism. It's fine. I mean, it's not fine, but it's fine. I'd call it inoffensive if it wasn't for the fact that it's so offensive. Honestly, I didn't realize I cared so much about Peter Pan until I wrote this section. Is this like the only Disney movie where I think a live-action remake might be warranted. Who am I kidding? They're just going to remake the animated version and add insecure genre-savvy humor to make it seem like they're not a soulless corporation incapable of human emotion. Like they didn't just make a joke about the early death of Peter Pan's voice actor in a theatrically released film this very year because they thought it would be funny. What was I talking about? Oh, right. I'm putting Peter Pan above Alice in Wonderland, but below Dumbo.
This is the night, it's a beautiful night.
We are Siamese, if you please.
I blame the King and I for this. Weird, outdated Orientalism aside, I like this movie. Guys, I like this movie a lot. You'd imagine this one has the same sticking point for me that Bambi did, in that this movie is nothing but cutesy animal saccharine bullshit. And I will admit there is some of that here, but I think the big difference which changes the whole thing for me is that in Bambi, the obnoxious, overly sweet little animals voiced by children felt artificial. It felt like an adult's idea of what a child is like or should be like. Whereas in Lady and the Tramp, although this movie is very much trying to sell you on the cuteness of dogs and a human's idea of what a dog should be, it sells itself much better by the dogs not behaving in a way that feels performative. Lady calls her owners Jim, Dear, and Darling because that is what they call each other, and this is something which the dogs discuss as if it were a simple fact. The misunderstanding of the names isn't paraded in front of the audience for them to giggle at. So instead of coming across as fake and sugary, it comes across as charming. I guess this doesn't work for everyone. I have friends who have told me they still find this movie schmaltzy and vapid, but the dogs in this movie just do it a lot better for me than any of the baby animals in Bambi ever did. The owners are a bit overly sweet and sincere at the start of the movie in a way that's rather eye-roll worthy though.
Have you noticed, darling? Since we've had Lady, we see less and less of those disturbing headlines.
Yes, I just don't know how we ever got along without her.
But I think it sells itself better when later in the movie, although the humans are never portrayed as monstrous or evil, it shows that Lady is very much a pampered rich person's pet lapdog. Something she wasn't even aware of until the Tramp comes into the movie and broadens her horizons a bit. Speaking of which, do you ever think about the fact that unironically Lady and the Tramp has one of the best romance structures of a Disney film? Rather than elbowing the audience, making fun of the trope that you can't marry a man you've just met before doing the trope anyway and hoping that if you lampshade it, it'll look like brilliant meta-commentary, Lady and the Tramp instead have the two characters meet each other way before anything resembling romance starts, have a good amount of time go by before reintroducing the characters, having the Tramp help Lady, which gets her to start having feelings for him, before she learns in the Pound, which she ends up in because of him, that he's a playboy and she's just the latest in a long string of girlfriends. But when they meet up again, she's realistically upset about what happened to her due to the Tramp's actions, furious at him for leading her on emotionally. And when he leaves after she yells at him, you hear her crying and humiliated, only for him to come rushing to help her when he hears her barking at the rat, and all their personal issues are put aside to save the baby. Look, it's not the most complex relationship put to film, but at least a relationship with something going on between both characters. And also, both characters actually get to have personalities. Lady might be portrayed as naive and sheltered, but she very much has her own feelings and thoughts about things completely removed not only from the romance, but also completely removed from the Tramp. And after a parade of main female characters who are either too perfect to be relatable or too substanceless to have anything going for them, I appreciate a character like Lady, even if it's not exactly an in-depth psychological breakdown of her inner workings. Also, I love the art direction of this movie. The backgrounds are gorgeous, and being the first animated Disney movie in widescreen lets you really drink in the atmosphere. The animation on all the dogs is also fantastic. I think it's another reason it works for me better than Bambi. We see the characters act in ways that are recognizably dog-like and lovable, but we also get to see the exact same characters quite literally bare their teeth at moments. The cinematography is also very clever. It's not that we don't see human faces in this movie, but the entire film, apart from one or two scenes, is entirely shot from the eye level of a dog, making simple houses, parks, and roads seem much bigger than they are. I like this movie. It looks good, it moves good, I like the characters, I like the art, and I like the obvious affection for the subject matter the filmmakers clearly had. I'm putting this one at the top of the list. Fantasia might be the better artistic conquest, but Lady and the Tramp at no point felt like a drag to sit through.
I know you, I walked with you once upon a dream.
This is it. The movie that almost killed the studio. More so than the other movies that almost killed the studio. This one really almost killed the studio. In the most reductive explanation possible, it was in big part due to the process involved with painting the backgrounds. Although he had been working on backgrounds for Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, as well as a few shorts, one of which won an Academy Award, Sleeping Beauty was the first film where artist Ivan Earle either painted every single background on the film or did touch-ups and adjustments to the backgrounds done by his assistants. For the look of Sleeping Beauty, rather than lean into the realism of Lady and the Tramp or the modern style of the 1950s that Mary Blair's art direction has, Sleeping Beauty's art design was based on the look of medieval tapestries and paintings. Earle's art style and method was based on starting with solid black paint and then meticulously layering color on top of it, which resulted in probably some of the most breathtaking backgrounds ever seen in a Disney film. The problem is, this method took paint. A lot of paint. An insane amount of paint. Along with several other technological steps forward involving the sound and the brand new 70mm film print, which demanded the backgrounds be drawn much larger than previous films. Meaning, you guessed it, more paint. Sleeping Beauty's production cost was double that of any of the previous films released in the 1950s, including Lady and the Tramp.
That's why it took us 6 years and $6 million to make Sleeping Beauty.
The film did relatively well in theaters in terms of the money it brought in, but sadly, because of the film's exponential cost, it didn't make a profit. And alongside the poor performance of Disney as a whole during that decade, the company filed its first annual loss, which hadn't happened since the Second World War. This led to mass layoffs and a complete upheaval and restructure of the company's approach to animation. Now, this wasn't completely just the background's fault, of course. Walt Disney himself had shifted his focus on live-action features, TV shows, as well as the construction of Disneyland, which he was far more interested in than the animation department by this point, for complicated reasons too much to just offhandedly mention here. But also, nothing moved in the animation department without his approval. So Sleeping Beauty would often languish for weeks waiting for Walt to sign off of it, while Walt was preoccupied and unable to give closer attention to it in the writing department, leading to several contemporary critics to call its story mediocre and its characters flat and uninteresting compared to previous films. So yeah, it wasn't just the backgrounds, but the backgrounds sure didn't help. However, the film has gone on through various re-releases in theaters and on home media to be the second most profitable film of the entire year of 1959, bested only by Ben-Hur. Ivan Earle was fine after Sleeping Beauty, in case you were worried. The man was renowned before Disney as a professional artist and returned to full-time painting a few years later. And despite the financial catastrophe that Sleeping Beauty was at the time, it's what most people know him best for these days. So all things worked out in the end, one way or another. Alright, the film itself. Sleeping Beauty is a strange little movie, and proof that you can base an entire film's longevity in pop culture on a dress. Because Princess Aurora is barely a character in the story, despite the title being about her. That's not a problem though, because Aurora is not the main character. The main characters of this film are the three good fairies. But I suppose you can't title a movie The Three Good Fairies from Sleeping Beauty.
You could if you weren't a fucking coward!
When this film was released, a lot of critics said it was derivative of Snow White and Cinderella without capturing what made those movies special. But I have to disagree. I'd say this movie was a crystallization of the elements of the previous two. The only parts I think that don't work are the animal friends in this movie have no point. In Snow White, it was due to the animal friends that the dwarves were warned about the witch. And in Cinderella, not only were the mice crucial in the spell, but they also not only helped her make the first dress, but were also the reason Cinderella escaped from her room at the end. In Sleeping Beauty, the animals appear for one small scene at the start and are quite literally never seen again. They feel included in the film more out of obligation because by this point Disney had a brand it had to adhere to, rather than it being for a good story reason. Aurora isn't the lead character like Snow White or Cinderella was, but I think that might be the fault of the audience expecting her to be. The film is called Sleeping Beauty, but that's the name of the fairy tale, not so much the name of the character. Maybe the movie could have been benefited from being called The Sleeping Beauty, but I imagine people would still have complained. But the three fairies this movie is about are incredibly likable, and I don't think we spend enough time focusing on the fact that this is an entire Disney movie whose main characters are elderly women.
Thank you for being a friend.
But really, all of that is just fluff, because the real core of this film is that this is what you get if you fuse Snow White and Fantasia into a single movie. This film lives and dies by its art, and my god, the art in this movie. The multiplane camera is being used to such an extent I've only seen in Bambi up until now. Earl's background art mixed with the insane attention to detail and the sound design gives this movie such an insane feeling of scope and depth to it. This is as close as it's possible to fall inside a book illustration. The brief few seconds of Aurora singing in the forest before the music fully kicks in is one of the most ethereal moments ever put in a Disney movie. I was curious as to whether the special effects when Aurora receives the fairies as gifts were done by Herman Schultheis, because this movie was in production for such a long period of time, but his name isn't anywhere on the credits, so I think this must have been after he wandered into the Guatemalan jungle never to be seen again. The entire sequence of Aurora being led to prick her finger on a phantom spinning wheel, which exists only to curse her, showing King Stephen's burning every wheel in the kingdom was always in vain, is one of my favorite segments in an animated film, both for the visuals as well as the music and the sound design all coming together. Speaking of, I think some people who dislike this movie might get over their confusion with its tone if they paid more attention to the fact that this movie is based off of a ballet. To the point, almost all of the melodies of the songs and the background music itself is from Tchaikovsky's original work, which may explain why it feels so unreal and dreamlike for a lot of it. If you're looking for a story that goes beyond the broadest archetypes, you're not going to find it here. Nor are you going to find an interesting princess character for little girls to look up to, because that's not what the film is trying to be. What it is trying to be is a sophisticated art piece. And although the character animation, although masterful in some places, is a little less revolutionary than Peter Pan, the backgrounds, colors, direction of shot, and art style all push through any weakness the acting might have caused. This film is insane, and I don't think I ever realized it until I sat down and rewatched it again as an adult. How does a movie this highly elevated come from Disney? Also, just as a side note, sometimes I've seen people confused as to why Maleficent is so petty and obsessed to hunt down the princess for 16 years just because she wasn't invited to a party. And I think people would have a lot less trouble if they know Maleficent in the fairy tale is a fae. Like, the second you learn that detail, it's like, oh, okay, now it makes sense. I think Disney turned her into a witch just so there wasn't confusion between why the good fairies are good when Maleficent isn't. But it explains a lot about the film as a whole when you're aware of this. Like why the king didn't immediately sick his guards on her when she first showed up, why they treat her with respect, and why the fairies appear to know her. Also, something I've always wondered is why Maleficent is drawn for most of the film to look how you'd imagine, but only in the very first scene she shows up in, she's drawn to look really beautifully. I always wondered about that. Anyway, this movie is one of the best looking things I've ever seen in my life. I'm struggling to decide whether to put it above or under Lady and the Tramp. But for how utterly ludicrous the art is and how much of its visuals will be sticking with me, I think I'll put it at the top of the list. And that's the first section done. Despite the massive setbacks, Sleeping Beauty didn't kill the animation studio, although it caused the department to completely change animation methods thanks to iWorks. Yeah, that iWorks, who had been playing around with some new technology.
Very nice work, Brother Dominic. Thank you. Very nice. Now, I would like 500 more sets.
Brother Dominic, how are you?
Could you do a big job for me?
The Xerox 9200 duplicating system, unlike anything we've ever made, feeds and cycles originals, has a computerized programmer that controls the entire system, can duplicate, reduce, and assemble a virtually limitless number of complete sets, and does it all at an incredible 2 pages per second.
Here are your sets, Father. The 500 sets you asked for.
It's a miracle.